When we're talking about sex and sexuality in our contemporary Western society, then quite often the question comes up about gender identity and about sexual orientation and so on. And actually in our research with Valerie, we did not focus that much on this, so there's not that much that we can say. But still, as it is such a hot topic in our contemporary society, I cannot not talk about it. So what I will be doing in this video is I'll give you some of the reflections that I have made myself, but you should not take them as the truth. You can just use them as some kind of benchmark for making your own thoughts on this. Now, let's start with gender identity. Basically, some people are born in a body and they think that this is the wrong body. They believe God made a mistake or that something went wrong, and basically they have the genitals of a man, but they feel themselves a woman, or vice versa. Now, how can we explain this? I mean, is there any relationship with the types or the instincts? Has this anything to do with the gendered energy that I was talking about in the previous video? Well, the simple answer is I don't know. And I actually think that it is not related. I think it is related to two other things. I think it is related to the stages of cognitive development. So these are the different stages that I was referring to in the first lesson. But I think there is also a strong relationship to the levels of development, the ones that Riso and Hudson were talking about, the levels of health, the levels of the ego strength, basically. Because I believe that in the higher levels of development, there is a high level of self-acceptance. We accept things as they are. We believe that we are part of something bigger. And this higher level of consciousness that we're part of, or God, or whoever has created us, doesn't make any mistakes. We feel that we're part of it. Whereas the lower we go in levels of development, we have more and more problems accepting who we are. And maybe this has to do with it. Again, I don't want to be a reductionist and say it's all about the levels of development and the people who have this type of gender identity issues, they're all at a low level of development. No, not at all. But I do believe that it plays a role, and that for some people, indeed, it is part of the explanation. Because indeed, it's much wider than just the levels of health. I mean, we should not only look through it from the psychological lens, but also we should look at sociology, we should also look at biology. Because, for example, in nature, there are certain species that are hermaphroditic. And they have both the male and the female genitals. There are some other species that can actually change their biological sex. And even among humans, there are children who are born with genitals of both male and female. About 1 out of 3,800 kids that is born, you cannot say that they're a boy or a girl. There's many more cases that may have some kind of remnants of the genitals of a second sex, and these are very often just surgically removed immediately after birth. But there are kids who are born and go through life with basically two biological sexes, and at some stage in their life a decision has to be made of how do they identify and what is their biological sex going to be. But there is also the sociological angle. For example, in India, there's the group of the Hijras. There's some kind of third gender. You also have the case of Albania in the past, where sometimes women would take a vow of chastity and they would go through life as a man in a very, very patriarchal society, actually. And also, if we're looking at some of the native tribes in Alaska, for example, if a family only had daughters, then they would actually decide that one of these daughters is going to go through life and play the social role of a man. So clearly it's a very complicated matter, and we have to look at the biological, psychological and sociological aspects of it. But there is one very important thing that I want to say here, and is that this has nothing to do with sex. Gender identity is all about identity. It's about how do we perceive ourselves, how do we see ourselves as part of society? Now, in the past, we used this kind of markers of identity, like having a common language, what is my religion, what's my job, what's my language. But in the last few decades, we're no longer using these. Nationalism has faded away a little bit in our society, so we no longer identify with our nation or our citizenship. Religion is no longer that important, so we're no longer identifying with our religion. So many people somehow feel lost in our society about their identity, and they're trying to understand, like, who am I? And they just revert to sex. And they're just looking at, well, am I a man? Am I a woman? So that's why they start identifying them. In the past, somebody would say that I'm a Belgian and I speak Dutch. But now there are some people who are more interested in defining themselves through their biological sex or their gender. And this is where these gender pronouns come from that you may see quite often in the US. This whole thing about he, him, his. This has nothing to do with sex. It has only to do with identity. Now, when we're talking about gender identity, quite often automatically we move into the topic of sexual orientation. So, are certain types or instincts more prone to be homosexual, heterosexual, bisexual, pansexual, and so on? Well, for example, Naranjo claimed that homosexuality is very common among male fours. Some other teachers and writers have said that there are many lesbians among the female aides. Now, is this true? Well, my conclusion is that there is no basis on which we can claim that these assumptions are right. We cannot say that one type is more prone than the other, basically because we do not have any statistical data. There's only some kind of observations, but they may be also biased. So more research would be needed. However, something that we did notice is that quite often female 9s, 2s and 4s tend to be more pansexual, meaning that they are attracted to a person regardless of their sex. But yet again, we have no statistics. And carrying out a real survey would statistically be pretty difficult, actually, especially because we also live in a highly ideologized society. So I also believe that the question is not like which type is more prone to be homosexual or bisexual or heterosexual. No, I think it's more important to understand what is the attitude of each type towards their own sexual orientation. Are certain types more prone to be honest? Are certain types more prone to be open to others? Are some types more prone to repressing their gender, their sexual orientation if it does not fit the social norm? So basically, let's have a brief look at the 9 types. We're not going to draw too many conclusions, so let's not take things out of context. But again, this is just to give you some kind of indication of what you may want to look at. So let's start with type 1. Type 1 is very judgmental, and they can be very criticizing. So basically, if a type 1 is growing up in a conservative society where homosexuality is not allowed, they can be very, very critical of people who are not conforming to the norm. But on the other side, if somebody is growing up in an environment that is very much LGBTI friendly, they may become some kind of crusaders that are defending the rights of lesbians, gays, and so on and so on. And it's only when type 1 at a higher level of development that they start becoming a little bit more balanced, more neutral, that they're not going to take such a very strong opinion about this. At the higher levels of development, they may become a little bit more nuanced and actually start accepting other views as well. Now, type 2 is quite different because type 2 has this very accepting quality and they're not going to judge publicly that much. However, they may have a lot of shame themselves if their sexual orientation is somehow socially not accepted. Now, some writers like Judith Searle and Gatt, they said that that twos are actually sexually more explorative, and they're more prone to play with gender roles and with sexual orientation than many other types. And there's definitely some arguments that hint into that direction. However, we cannot make any firm conclusions on that, but it is something that you may want to look at. Now, type 3 is very, very conscious of their gender roles and polarity. And in a conservative society, a male tree is really going to want to project an image of masculinity, and a female tree may want to portray an image of femininity. So if they have a homosexual orientation, they may really try to hide it, and they may also have some kind of strong identity crisis. Others may be very, very good at faking their image. They may really be in touch with their homosexual desires, but they are still going to project an image of masculinity or femininity towards the outwardly. Now, in a more liberal environment, trees may actually play with multiple images. In a certain setting, they may be hiding their sexual orientation, and in other environments, they may actually make this homosexuality part of their image towards the others. So if we're looking at a type 4, now type 4 is extremely accepting of any form of authentic expression of sexual desire and identity. And no matter if it is a repressed society, sexually repressed society, or a more liberal environment, type 4 is more going to be accepting of whatever the orientation may be. However, what can happen with type 4 is that they may actually decide to go for a different sexual orientation just in order to be somehow having this sense of authenticity. Now, type 5 is quite secretive and very private. So very often this person is actually not going to tell anything about their sexual orientation. You're actually not going to see it. And actually very often type 5s, they can almost have some kind of asexual look, whereas in reality they have a very, very active sex life, but they're just not going to broadcast this to the rest of the world because they're just too secretive about their personal life. And they can also have a very anonymous and compartmentalized approach to sex. So, and this really can fit the gay lifestyle very well for them. The other thing about type 5 is that they have very good rationalization skills. So they can actually justify why they may not conform to the norm. And on top of that, they may also have challenges really being in touch with their emotions. So they may not necessarily have the same emotional struggles that other types may have. But again, we should not generalize. Now, type 6 may have an increased self-doubt if their sexual orientation does not fit the social standards. And it may really reinforce their ambiguous feelings around the topics of masculinity and femininity. But the sexual 6, of course, can be more outspoken and really be more outing themselves with regards to their sexual orientation. Type 7 really likes to enjoy life, and they're not questioning themselves too much. So they're also not caring too much about social standards, and if they have to transgress the social norms, they seem to be pretty fine with that. So they're not really hampered in expressing themselves freely. So as a result of that, they may be the most comfortable with just following their homosexual or bisexual desires, and they're also not needing any approval. It doesn't mean that they're going to out themselves the most easily, but they're just going to live the way that they want to live it. And on top of that, quite often they may really like experimenting and variety, so they may actually just play with homosexuality, they may play with bisexuality just because they just want to experience something different. Now, type 8 is probably the most direct and assertive. when it comes to sexual orientation. First of all, if they are homosexual or bisexual, they're the most likely to be very open about it. They're most often not going to hide it, but they're really going to defend themselves because they really want to fight injustice. And they are very confident about outing themselves and about standing up for the rights of people who may be oppressed because of this homophobia. And finally, type 9. Type 9 is extremely tolerant to sexual diversity, let's call it. They're not going to judge anybody. It's a little bit, well, whatever is fine with people, so be it. But quite often, because they have this self-narcotization, they may not be really in touch with their own sexual orientation. They may be homosexual, but they don't really see it. And the other thing is that they may also end up in a homosexual relationship without actually really wanting it. Of course, we're talking here about examples of the lower levels of development when they're not in touch with themselves, but it is something that can happen when they're fixated in type 9. So again, what I wanted to do in this video was just give some kind of the thoughts that I have made about this topic, but they're definitely not based on extensive research.